Hello and welcome to this Refugee Week lecture co-organised by the University of York and City College, University of York, Europe campus. Without further ado, because you're not here to listen to me, we'll move over to our speaker. It gives me enormous pleasure to welcome Phevos Simeonidis. Sorry, my Greek is not up to scratch. Phevos is an open source intelligence and audiovisual forensics researcher and an archivist. He is an MA graduate from the Center for Research Architecture, a research and investigative partner on Omnia TV and The Manifold, and the former director and co-founder of Disinfo Collective in Athens, Greece. Later this year, he'll be joining Durham University as a PhD student. He's a frequent collaborator with, among others, Forensic Architecture, Lighthouse Reports, and his work focuses on far and alt-right narrative creation and performativity online, militarized border regimes and surveillance, and human rights violations in the external borders of the EU. And his talk today is called Whose Truth? Exposing Human Rights Abuses in Greece. So I'll hand over to Phevos. Thank you very much, Phevos.
Thank you very much, Matt. Thank you to everyone that's online right now joining us. Thank you to everyone that's in this room. And I would also like to thank in advance everyone that has made this possible. That's many people, but just to name a very few apart from you, Matt, and everyone else online, I would like to thank Zoe, Alexandra, and Calliope here from the City campus. And again, I would like to thank everyone that's been attending the summer school, so the lovely audience that I have here. So if you see that I will be looking at the room and not at the camera sometimes, that's just because it's a little difficult to focus only on the camera when there's live people as well in the room, but I'll try to do my best. So it's a very interesting situation to be here right now, one day after a new government was elected yesterday, and just days after, almost a week and a half after one of the deadliest shipwreck incidents in the Ionian Sea between Greece and Italy and north of Libya, a shipwreck that I'm sure most of you through media publications and elsewhere have heard about, have seen. And what is most interesting about the shipwreck in terms of how the narrative has been unfolding around it is basically that it was yet one more time treated as an isolated incident. It was treated as just another shipwreck in a route of many shipwrecks, but still nobody speaks in the public domain about how this is part of a larger structure, how we get to include this as only one part of a larger narrative around the securitization of Europe, the securitization of borders. So where we are right now, what's the situation in Greece? What's the situation in the European Union? Currently, Greece has elected a new government, which is the previous government, plus some new parties entering the parliament. We have many people, what many people call a turn towards a more conservative parliament overall, even though the governing party is going to remain the same with a grand majority in the parliament. And when it comes to the European Union space, we are just in the process of discussing the new pact on migration. We have huge developments in the sense of the UK leaving the European Union and post-Brexit management of migration in the Isles and elsewhere. And we also have a turn towards a trend of building more fences, getting more drones, getting more surveillance, combining, fingerprinting databases. We have Eurodac and unofficial versions of Eurodac, such as Balkan-Dac, which is the equivalent for the Balkan states. So amidst this apparatus of securitization that's ever been increasing in the past years, what are human rights abuses and how can we define them? How can we measure them? And even further, how can we expose them? How can we raise awareness about them? And how can we eventually get some sort of a remedy towards the people that are victims of these abuses? Usually when we think of human rights abuses, especially recently, we think of them from a European-centric point of view as pertaining to violations and abuses against people that are displaced, people on the move, displaced communities and displaced individuals. But I would like to think through the concept of human rights abuses and grounding it also to the local communities, to the local spaces and to the towns and countries that people in this room come from, be it in Europe and be it elsewhere, but also to myself as a Greek citizen living in this country and working in this country as well, in this field also, but also in other work that I've done in the past. So how would I perceive human rights abuses also as a citizen? And there are issues like conditions of detention. There are issues like police brutality and abuse of police authority, or Coast Guard brutality and abuses of Coast Guard authority. There is an attack on the rule of law that also affects local citizens as well. And it's not only limited, this violence is not only limited, obviously, to people on the move and displaced communities. So what are the responses that we usually see, and how the truth is constructed? There is media work, and there is media work that speaks about these abuses, and there's media work that is on purpose created to hide these human rights abuses. There's research conducted in the academia in spaces such as our universities and faculties and our institutions that is seeking to expose these human rights abuses. And at the very same time, there is research, academic research, that's very much used, it's very much funded for, it's very much produced in order to hide these human rights abuses, or even to help perpetrate them in the first place. And then there is also legal interventions, which are also twofold. There's legal interventions to combat these human rights abuses. There's legal interventions that are seeking to provide this justice, to create reparative systems, and move away from carcerality, or they try to provide people with at least the right to truth, the right to know what happened to their loved ones in certain cases, and receive some sort of compensation, financial, ethical, or political and social. But there's also legal interventions that seek to do exactly the opposite. They seek to further allow for the perpetration and enable and instigate the perpetration of human rights abuses. Yet when we speak about truth, I'm not here to talk to you about one kind of truth that I know of and I'm happy to share with you, because that kind of truth doesn't really exist. So I'm not going to be speaking about a claim that I make here or that my colleagues are making around the world right now when it comes to investigating these violations. But I'm going to speak to you about how we, and obviously I'm not speaking on the name of anyone, but how colleagues and the whole spectrum of human rights abuses investigations in Greece is being treated when it comes to countering a certain truth that is constructed by the state, is constructed, aided and abetted by media organizations on the mainstream field, or on the fringes of media ecosystems. And we're reaching this point of a post-truth that is not necessarily, we are not necessarily able to combat. I'll start with an example. On the May 2021, there was a visit of the European parliamentarian Tineke Strik in the, at the time, under construction camp of Samos, which is an EU-funded facility for, it's called a multi-purpose closed controlled access center, which in my personal opinion is a very fancy word for a prison. But so this Europarliamentarian was there and was assisted, and who was present was a representative of the Ministry of Migration of Greece, and at the same time, a journalist. Sir journalist Ingeborg Böhel, some months after, in November 2021, asked the Prime Minister of Greece, the then Prime Minister, who is now re-elected, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, about pushbacks, about allegations of human rights violations that the Greek authority forces are committing, and also about conditions in detention. So Mr. Mitsotakis at the time very vigorously told her that this is not true, that he will not allow her to come into this building and insult him. And this, what is now famous in the activist circles and has become a meme, the famous phrase, "Have you been to Samos?" To which Ingeborg Böhel replied, "Yes, I've been." And Mr. Mitsotakis said, "No, you have not," while she was there under an official visitation of a Europarliamentarian. So how can you combat someone that talks to someone that they invited or their administration did and says, you have not been to that place, even though someone that I'm connected to invited you there? And this is obviously not the most important example of hiding truth, but it shows very well what can happen in the public discourse, even when it comes to whether someone that is not a person on the move visited a certain space that they should or should not have access to. But this is not the only issue here, as we are moving towards a certain degree of criminalization that is unprecedented in Greece. We have a criminalization of all possible aspects of intervention against these human rights abuses. We have the criminalization of rescuers, we have the criminalization of rescue activity in itself, and activism of all sorts. There is still a place to operate in Greece as an activist and as a rescuer, but this is limited every single day that passes. Then there is criminalization of the reporters that are covering the criminalization of the rescuers and the activists. And there's also the criminalization of the very victims of certain journeys. There's the criminalization of the very people. And one of the largest examples that I can give to you today is the criminalization of the boat drivers, which is a reoccurring trend throughout Europe right now, but in Greece we've seen it in a large scale. For those of you that might not be familiar with this, and thinking and echoing certain discussions that are happening right now about the channel and the boat crosses and the small boats, and how do we stop this small boats narrative that's being discussed right now. Basically what Greece does is it cherry picks certain people out of its crossing and saying that these people are the ones that were the smugglers or are in touch with the smugglers. And getting back to the Pylos incident of the recent shipwreck, that was for 12 hours without mobility. It was stuck. We know that it was at least for 12 hours stuck. The Greek authorities, upon saving and rescuing, eventually after hours, roughly 104 people out of the alleged 750 that were on the incident, charged 9 people with being the boat drivers. And I'm not here to tell you if these people were the boat drivers or not. I'm not here to tell you whether they have anything to do with smuggling or not. I actually I have no information to share with you on that note. But it strikes me as very interesting when everyone says that this boat was packed, and we've seen visual evidence of it, that someone that seeks to profit from such a journey would remain there and would allow themselves to be part of that shipwreck if they were actually the ones that made so much money, allegedly, right, to get all these people there. Moving forwards, all this is portrayed in the public domain as a sense of crisis. And I cannot help but always think, whenever I hear the word crisis, refugee crisis, migrant crisis, is it a crisis of refugees? Is it a crisis of migrants? Is it a crisis of who really? Or is it a crisis of the lack of social support and safe passage and safe entry that leads to that so-called crisis? And I cannot help, again, but think of the work of Janet Reutemann on anti-crisis, the book Anti-Crisis, where they mentioned that what crisis actually tells us is more about how we consider normalcy rather than a state of emergency. Yet the state of emergency is being created, is being replicated across European countries. We've seen that in many states around since 2015 to justify, and here we move on to the next level, the lack of documentation, the lack of registering, and the lack of paper trail also for certain orders that create these human rights abuses and enable them. And that can be from the acquisition of equipment that is used to perform these human rights abuses up to deniability later onwards. Because there's one thing that's true, and I think that everyone that has done work in human rights can verify that it's very difficult to litigate, it's very difficult to investigate, it's very difficult to do research on something that there is no proof of. Thinking of the largest and biggest crimes that we've seen as a human race, anything that we know, most that we know, the ones that managed to get the attention of the people, is because there was visual evidence, because there was some sort of paper trail, there was some sort of registering, not only on the verbal history of the amount of people that it affected, but also there was some tracing that we could do back. So effectively, practices such as the pushbacks that are ongoing in the Aegean Sea or in the land borders or other borders across Europe and even beyond Europe. I mean, many times people are criticizing me and other colleagues of not speaking against the human rights abuses that Turkey is performing. And I think that there is no one that can deny that. Or obviously, I mean, the US is also performing human rights abuses in the Arizona desert and elsewhere. I mean, on our cities everywhere, right? The same goes for Australia. So there is this replication of this non-documentation of these human rights abuses. So the question is then, how can we tackle them? Furthermore, what happens when we actually allow ourselves to trust in the very authorities that perform the human rights abuses to investigate themselves on whether they actually performed human rights abuses? And I mean, in all honesty, why would they admit to that? And now here comes the question of what is our role in constructing an alternative claim? And what is our role in getting in touch with the survivors, getting in touch with advocates on the field, getting in touch with volunteers, with people higher up in organizations, with even with state actors that seem sometimes, not very often, unfortunately, sympathetic, let's say, to a probable cause. So in Greece, that has been a contentious field because Greece is developing new state-driven organizations, organizational, let's say, structures that are seeking to actually investigate these. So the first one was the Greek ombudsman, who was given certain authorities to investigate cases of police brutality. Back in the day and still ongoing, we have a set of internal investigations, let's call it the internal affairs investigations of security forces. We have the new Fundamental Rights Committee that was now put in place in Greece. And we also have a very interesting organization structure, which is called the National Transparency Authority. And I want to speak about it a minute here. So back some, I think it's like a year and a half now, there was very big research in collaboration between many media led by Lighthouse Reports that I also had the pleasure of being part of the investigation. And it was concerning human rights abuses and specifically pushbacks in Croatia, in Greece, in Romania, and other places adjacent to these borders. What was really interesting is that after this caught the attention of the people, the National Transparency Authority in Greece decided to investigate and see whether, as we were told, the claims that we make in this are actually legit. So what I found very interesting, and I mean, in itself, the whole project of investigating our investigation was quite funny in the sense that they didn't even manage to properly redact the document that they published in the end, so they had to retract it, and they allowed us to have access, you know, everyone, you as well, to have access to the names of the people they interviewed. So basically, getting to the concept of truth, in the research that they did, a big part of it was asking local people whether they agree or not with border policies. So it wasn't a question about whether they know of the events we speak, specifically only, or whether they have performed these themselves, but they asked local people, they asked security forces personnel at a percentage of roughly 41%. And I know that they asked security personnel at that percentage because, as I told you, accidentally, they didn't redact the document properly, so we could actually see who they asked. We had their names, and it was publicly available for 3 days. They also asked priests, which is quite an interesting. I mean, you know, I guess they could have asked whether this is with the blessings of the higher authority or not, but we don't really know why they were asking these questions up until we read the report. And I figured then that indeed, if you want to legitimize something, it doesn't really matter if the people are okay with it, and you can then continue to perform these human rights abuses. There was a big discussion in the public in Greece when this amazing latest report by New York Times was published, which shows a pushback, like it's the most complete, in my opinion, recording we have of the pushback being in operation in the Aegean Sea. So we have the people being stopped, moved from a van, put in a boat, then to another, and then being dropped in the water on an inflatable boat. And many people said, like, oh, but this is going to change things, right? Like this must change things. And this was I think, a day before the first elections that we had. And there is a legitimization that happens also. So obviously certain people that were already interested in the topic, they read about it. But then there was a whole lot of people that said, oh, that's great. So that means that the current government, which we want to vote again for, is protecting our borders, is pushing back people. Yeah, it might be illegal, but that's not the case here. We don't care. These people are being pushed back, and that's what matters. And then the question becomes, how do you counter, how do you combat a certain narrative that, you know, like when I go to someone and I say like, hey, you know, pushbacks, we shouldn't do pushbacks at the state because they're illegal. And they say, yeah, okay, but I like pushbacks. I like what they do. I like what they result to. So how can you intervene on the public sphere and say like, yeah, but they are illegal? And I'm not saying I have the answer to that, but I'm sharing the question because I think that this is replicating throughout contexts in Greece and the European Union and beyond that, way more beyond that. So where are we at the moment? There is discussions of legalizing illegal actions. I think we were talking about it yesterday, the day before yesterday on the workshop here. Like, there are states that are trying to legalize what they consider to be legal pushbacks while they are performing them as illegal actions. And at the same time, they try to illegalize certain actions that are very much legal and people should be allowed to perform, such as search and rescue, search and recovery. And I think that one troubling, and also for everyone that's watching us from the UK or is from the UK here in the room, and the US, is that there is this know-how exchange. So the same way we've seen all these years activist circles speaking together and saying how we combat, you know, across contexts, across borders, across countries, now states are doing the same. And I remember listening to people from a US defense meeting saying to each other, like, we can do what Greece does. And somebody was like, no, sorry, we cannot, it's illegal. And they were like, yeah, but it's cool, it's good. We should try to do that. And there was the same thing with detention. I mean, both Priti Patel and Suella Braverman were very happy to learn from the Greek authorities and are trying to learn how to apply certain things. Most recently, there's this discussion about the barges, these large floating structures that will host people, hosting huge quotation marks, and people think of this as something new, while they forget, and people that have experience with the Greek aspect of the refugee crisis and the refugee summer of 2015, that it was actually used both in the islands of Greece and in Piraeus. That there was actually vessels that were at the time inactive that were used to host, again, huge quotation marks, certain people from the islands, because as part of this decongestion process. Now, going towards a conclusion here, in what has been like mostly thinking creatively about this and sharing with you certain ideas, how do we hone down on who profits from this? How do we hone down on who creates this narrative and for which purpose? And it's interesting when the European Union appears as an ever increasing fatherly, I would say, figure that seeks to support little states, seeks to involve them, and seeks in this like patronizing way, in a way, to say like, hey, I can give you more gifts, I can give you more equipment, I can help you make this great. And then when you actually use it for something bad, I will say that this was not my responsibility. What strikes me as interesting always is the blind panopticon, as we call it sometimes. So we have a space, and that's a European space, and I'm talking about the European space as the one I'm more familiar with, that is increasingly monitored by drones, by cameras, by thermal sensors, by audio wave frequency receptors, by phone signal receptors, by people on patrols, on bikes, on helicopters, on planes, on everything. Yet the first moment that someone says like, hey, I think my human rights were abused, and I would like to see that amount of footage, I would like to see that document, I would like to hear that radio message between these two police officers, then suddenly this panopticon turns blind. And they say like, oh, as recently in Phevos, oh, we forgot to turn on the recording, even if it concerns. Yet 3-4 days after, we found a document that was leaked that said that there was indeed a recording. So is there a recording, is there not? And then the passing on of responsibility goes to even more absurd ways. So one of the nicest examples of that was when, I think it was the Minister of Migration of Greece, when faced with certain allegations that were supported by video evidence of a pushback, said that we don't know who these people are. And these people, like the perpetrators, were people wearing Coast Guard uniforms on a Greek Coast Guard vessel in what looked to be within the Greek waters. And as I've shared with some of you, it's interesting to me that someone is willing to admit that there is a paramilitary, carnivalistic, group that bears ammunition and guns and is controlling vessels in our borders, but it's not the Hellenic Coast Guard. So the narrative that is created is always ruled by this, let's say, deflection of, I will say that this is not us. If somebody proves that it's us, I will say that it was us, but without our knowledge. If they say that, okay, it was us and we had knowledge, well, then it wasn't really an order. It was something that they did on their own. And if, well, it was an order, it was a bad apple of an officer that gave an order to another bad apple of an officer. And once we remove these two, we can start again. And this circle is never ending. I think I'll stop here sharing one quote that has stuck with me for years. Ever since I was in the National Archives in Kew in the UK, I was working with Professor Sadia Abbas from Rutgers University, and she was looking into what is now called the Mau Mau Rebellion, which is basically the operations of the empire in Kenya around the 1950s. And in that, there was correspondence from Eric Griffith Jones, which was the colony's Attorney General at the time, to the British governor. So, because this is part of the archive, this is like, think of it as a post-it, think of it as a side note that was said across anything that was going on in Kenya, which I will not recite, but was very brutal, the whole operation, as in many other places. And he says there, because if we are going to sin, we must sin quietly. I'd like to leave you with that thought, and thank you so much. And I mean, Matt, we can also get you back in the room. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Not the most uplifting answer, but a very, very interesting and I fear true one. So on behalf of all of us who are online, obviously I can't end your session there. On behalf of all of us who are online, thank you so much. And thank you very much to the audience at the University of York and elsewhere across the world, actually looking at the participants list for your questions. Thank you so much, Phevos, for a really fascinating talk. And we'll close down at this end and leave you to it. Thank you very much.